Picture this scene for me. Armed white militants are gunning down black civilians in the streets of South Africa in response to the removal and weakening of segregationist practices from the public workforce, all while doing so under what seems to be an unlikely banner. Now, if you know a thing about South African history, you may be thinking about the AWB and the Botswana crisis of 1994. But this is not about them or that event. No, that is 72 years too late for the topic of this episode. This is instead about the Communist Rand Revolt of 1922, where South African communists and other leftists fought under the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite and fight for a white South Africa." Yep, racist South African communists. One hell of a topic for a first video, eh?
So long, sorry, so long. We're all trekking along. We're going north and with lots to do. But you'll have us back when our job is through. So long, sorry, so long. On the South Left pump and then we'll come marching to Pretoria into your arms again.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Fugawi's Outpost. I'm your host Fugawi, and on this channel, I will be going over parts of Southern African military history that most people, both inside and outside of Southern Africa, are not aware of, with the intention of making it easy to understand and digest, while still going into enough depth to teach the viewers something new. For the first proper video on this channel, I will be discussing the failed communist revolution of 1922, also known as the Rand Revolt. This idea of a South African history series has been a passion project of mine for a good while now, and I have been working hard at researching it for your education and enjoyment. While in the future I will make an in-depth video or series covering absolutely everything about the Rand Revolt, this is more of a general overview with some anecdotes and events here and there. Sources are in the description of the video for your perusal. Please enjoy. In November 1921, the Rand Lords announced that they would be weakening the colour bar the following year. These Rand Lords were a small group of white capitalists who controlled the gold and diamond industries from the late 19th century onwards. They sought to reduce costs after World War I due to a fall in the price of gold, and they had chosen to do this by weakening the colour bar, or to put it plainly, by hiring cheaper black labour for jobs previously reserved for higher paid white workers. When the Rand Lords proposed their plan to the representative of the workers' unions, the South African Industrial Federation, or SAIF, it was outright rejected. After negotiations broke down, the workers went on a general strike. During this period of the strike, the South African government, led by Boer War hero Jan Smuts, chose not to get involved. Ideally, the government wanted the two parties to negotiate some form of peaceful settlement, but this was not to be. As the strike grew, certain towns of the Witwatersrand region began forming their own commando militias, and while these commandos claimed and insisted that they had no quarrel with the government and were merely existing to keep law and order, they were simultaneously teaching each other how to unseat horsemen and make bombs, which is, a rather mixed message. It is important to note that this strike was primarily stoked by fears of a race war between black and white South Africans, and fears from white workers of blacks taking away their jobs and livelihoods. According to one of the leaders in the strike and a member of the Labour Party in Parliament, Bob Waterson, he stated that 90% of white workers would be replaced if the Rand Lords had their way. This was obviously nowhere near the truth, given that it's 1922 South Africa, but to the white workers, this was merely a confirmation of their already existing biases about race. The first instance of violence between the police and these communist commandos occurred on the 18th of January 1922. A local communist commando disarmed and imprisoned two policemen guarding a pump house. They merged with another armed commando and planned to attack police stations in the area. The policemen were later released and returned to the pumping station when trade union leaders vetoed the commando members' actions. The two policemen stated that the commando carried a red flag and that nearly all wore red rosettes and talked much of a white South Africa. At a mine in Germiston around the same time, African workers were attacked by a crowd of white strikers and many had to be rescued by the police, with several black South Africans being killed and more than 20 being injured. The police claimed that this fighting was a ploy by the strikers to embarrass the authorities and intimidate the citizens, but the strike leaders claimed that the region was inflamed and that blacks were arming and anxious to attack whites, stating that it was mainly non-striking rabble-rousers who attacked blacks. But as we have already seen, and will see even more of, this goes against much of what the strikers themselves say and do. While I do use the term communists to describe the strikers I am referring to, there is a really important distinction to make. When people typically think of South African communism, they think of the South African Communist Party, the same one that had the racially progressive individuals such as the likes of Joe Slovo and at one point Nelson Mandela. While this is the same SACP that participated in the Rand Revolt, I will note that the communist policies on race and such changed over time, especially after the revolt ended and leadership changed. Furthermore, this revolt was not just the result of the SACP, it was also the result of the much bigger Communist Party at the time, the Labour Party, as well as apolitical trade unions with leftist but not communist members. Despite it being a large group of different leftist ideologies working together, what they would eventually be fighting for as a collective was an ethno-nationalist communist state, with Jan Smuts out of power, hence why I call them communists. This is just a clarification I wanted to make clear, as many people might get confused when I refer to the strikers as communists. Continuing their strike into February, the main leaders of the strike, Percy Fisher, remember his name, William Wortingham and Henry Spendeth, called for their commandos and strikers to arm themselves and to set up barricades across the Johannesburg area. Commandos became more violent and antagonistic in their actions towards blacks and scabs, as well as to the police. Over the course of a few days, there were many clashes between whites and blacks in the Johannesburg area. The situation was getting worse and worse, and the Star newspaper, who would be responsible for most of the coverage on the revolt, described how bands of white strikers shot and attacked unoffending Africans and coloured men as though they were on a rat hunt. As the threat of an attack on black workers, miners who were still working, also known as scabs, and mining administration officials grew and grew, certain mining companies eventually convinced local South African police units to spare some officers, weapons and ammunition in order to protect themselves. It was not much, and certain mines only had a few revolvers and Martini Henry rifles to spare. At the same time, the black workers of these mines were temporarily housed inside of the mines themselves, partially to avoid conflict with the strikers, whom the mine bosses were hoping would just return to work, and partially to keep them alive. All the while, tensions were growing every day. In certain areas, strikers who were turned off by the increasing violence from their militant allies and were now trying to get back to work were booed and jeered in public. Telephone wires were soon being cut across the region, and there was even an attempt to derail the train. Strikers began to harass policemen on patrols, and the police in turn began trying to desperately save any poor strikebreaker unfortunate enough to end up in the hands of the strikers. The situation was getting out of hand. To stop the commandos, the Commissioner of Police, Colonel Truter, issued a proclamation stating that the use of commandos to prevent officials working on essential services, or any person who forms or instigates such an act, is guilty of the crime of public violence. Although this proclamation did not stop the formation or the mobilization of the commandos, it did influence some of the strikers to attempt finding an end to the strike. These were the minority. At a public meeting, Percy Fisher, one of the leaders mentioned before, warned strikers against any local meetings to discuss terms with employers, even saying, quote, "The first man to return to work should be smashed until not a breath was left in his body." The police in turn no longer carried batons, instead they carried firearms, under a standing order for every officer to do so, and civilian volunteers at the local power plant had to work at night under constant police protection. The following day, in an attempt to neutralize the growing influence of the strike's leadership, the police arrested Fisher, Spendeth, Shaw and Wortingham for inciting public violence. Not much was achieved by this, and as soon as the 4 men were released in late February, they went right back to inciting violence and potential revolt. Violence continued to escalate, the government eventually choosing to recruit special police officers to defend the mines from any commando attack, which in turn allowed regular police officers to assist in policing the strikers themselves. The more moderate strike leaders, seeing the situation increasingly getting out of hand, chose to hold a ballot in order to see if a majority of strikers wanted to A. continue the strike, or B. instead just return back to work. The ballot never took place, for the 4 men mentioned before, led by Percy Fisher, decided to overthrow the moderates and call for a continued general strike. These militants successfully overthrew the moderate leadership after Percy convinced them to resign, and violence, especially violence targeted at non-white workers, continued to escalate. Meanwhile, the commandos continued to gather firearms under the pretense of protecting women and children from natives. It was clear at this point that the strike was turning into a full-scale revolution, and the government finally called upon reservists and soldiers for active duty. Simultaneously, the average white South African, who may have initially supported the strike, no longer did. It was too radical, and more importantly, the strikers in action in the workplace now affected the average South African, as utilities and services were no longer being kept active by the workers. More and more civilians were intimidated by large groups of strikers into stopping their work and joining the strike, and this soon culminated into absolute chaos. On the 9th of March, a red flag was flown on the flagpole in front of the town hall. Strikers began to meet, and black South Africans were still becoming victims of race-based violence. When the now heavily outnumbered police got involved in an attempt to protect the black civilians, they were fired upon by the commandos. The conflict of the revolution had now begun, but the main act was yet to come. The next day, on the 10th of March, explosions shook the Johannesburg area. Military, police, mining and railway institutions were attacked by communist commandos. Fighting began all throughout the Witwatersrand, with valiant but outnumbered police officers, mining officials and soldiers making brave stands against heavily armed rebels fighting from concealed positions. At Brakpan Mine, one of these stands took place, but once the outnumbered mining officials and police officers surrendered, they were executed, wounded and murdered in brutal fashion. Not even the wounded were spared from this violence. Communist snipers shot at both civilians and government forces from the roofs and windows of houses. Communist commandos intimidated businesses in the area into shutting down or into giving the aforementioned commandos free products. It was chaos. Martial law was declared by Jan Smuts, as more and more military personnel were rushed into the region to quell the revolution. Some of these military units were of great fame and renown, such as the Transvaal Scottish, and these same units were led by Delville Wood veteran and overall badass Colonel Thackeray. And while certain members of the strike leadership were arrested, Percy Fisher was still on the loose, leading the revolt from his headquarters at the trade hall in Johannesburg. Looting and the destruction of buildings by the rebels took place, and in certain areas it soon became an instance of urban warfare, as the outnumbered police officers fought the rebels from street to street, sometimes being besieged in their own police stations. At Fordsburg, an example of this bravery is evident. A group of only 11 police officers, led by Lieutenant MacDonald, defended their station from large swaths of rebels for an entire day and a half, up until they ran out of ammunition, at which point they then chose to split up and seek reinforcements. 2 civilians should be mentioned in relation to this event as well. A young boy, no older than 16, simply known to history as Simmons, ran back and forth to give the police ammunition throughout the whole ordeal, dodging sniper fire from concealed communists. The second civilian is a man named Marais. Marais hid one of the police officers from rebels when the police chose to flee, but this act came at the cost of his own life. The next day, he was brutally murdered by the rebels as a police spy. The man who is believed to be his killer, Samuel Long, was executed after the revolt ended, one of only 4 rebels to be executed for the revolt. On the 12th of March, the South African Air Force finally entered the fray, bombing rebel positions to great effect. This is the only time in South African history where the South African Air Force bombed South African cities. Rebel positions were also shelled by South African artillerymen, with the assistance of police officers doing spotting from concealed positions at the same time, increasing the psychological and physical effect it had on the rebels. The main rebel force had been routed, with most rebels in Brakpan surrendering or fleeing immediately on sight of enemy forces, but pockets of resistance, as well as the leadership of the revolt, were still holding out. On the 14th of March, for 70 minutes, 3 artillery pieces of the South African Army shelled the new main rebel holdout, before men of the South African infantry began to advance in a World War I style fashion. The reason the shelling was halted was due to a fear that the shells would accidentally kill police prisoners, which were being held hostage in the rebels' base of operations. It should be noted, as previously stated, that many of the soldiers involved, especially men of the officer corps, such as Colonel Thackeray, were experienced veterans of World War I, some of them even seeing service at the bloody Battle of Delville Wood. 75% of the Rand Light Infantry Regiment's men and officers had seen active service in World War I. It was a fight never in the rebels' favour. A weapon tank, HMLS Union, was sent to assist the soldiers, but it broke down during the fighting before it could do anything after getting stuck on a tram line. Despite that, its appearance on the battlefield alone reportedly caused multiple rebels to surrender. This is evidence of how the machines of war utilised by government forces had a great effect on the rebels' overall morale. A South African Army machine gun crew managed to sneak their way into one of the shop buildings directly next to rebel trenches, and soon this machine gun crew opened fire, killing and wounding many surprised rebels at what was essentially point-blank range, but soon their machine gun anticlimactically jammed. Despite this rather short-lived moment in the battle, the use of the machine gun at all had an incredibly demoralizing effect on the rebels, and soon, after other South African infantrymen, as well as the machine gun crew bayonet-charged rebel positions, many rebels immediately surrendered, putting the main fight of the revolt to an end. Two of the rebel leaders, one of whom was Percy Fisher, were found dead as a result of suicide. A note was found in the same room as their corpses, signed by the two men, stating that on March 14th, 1922, I died for what I believe to be right, the cause. At around the same time as the discovery of their bodies, the aforementioned police officers being held prisoner were found and safely secured without a fight. The army and police continued to clear buildings as snipers and any holdouts of resistance. The revolution was effectively over. At midnight on the 17th of March 1922, the now reinstated moderates of the SAIF called the strike off, and the government regained control of the Witwatersrand, restored law and order, and declared the ordeal over from midnight on the 18th of March. According to a government report on the matter, the official casualty list is as follows. 43 soldiers were killed and 133 soldiers injured, 29 policemen were killed and 86 injured, 39 revolutionaries were killed and 118 injured, with thousands more being captured and 4 of whom would later be executed. 42 civilians were killed and 197 were injured. It was a bloody affair. Strikers who were released from government detention anxiously reported for work, hoping to find out that their jobs had been held open for them. Many found themselves rejected because of their activities during the revolt. Almost 3,000 mine workers were left unemployed due to a review of the mine's labor force and their refusal to take back militant strikers. Even those who retained their jobs were subjected to lower earnings. In many ways, this was a rather sad end to the strike. The strikers ended up fucking themselves over with little achieved to show for it. The Rand Revolt had fairly big consequences for the leftist movement in South Africa. For example, one of the moderates who had stepped down, Bill Andrews, stepped back up into the leadership role and began welcoming in black South Africans into the South African Communist Party. The Labour Party, on the other hand, would continue working with the National Party, which is the party that would later instate apartheid. Jan Smuts would lose his next election to the National Party and Labour Party coalition, although this wasn't the end for old Jannie Smuts. He would be back in 1939, but that's a story for another episode. And that was the video. Thank you so much for watching, it truly means a lot. If you have any requests as to what I should cover next, or any suggestions as to how I could improve, then please let me know in the comments below. I do plan on making a much more in-depth video or series on the Rand Revolt, as I mentioned at the beginning. This was just something I wanted to give a shot beforehand. Again, thanks for watching, and stay safe.